Hi, I'm Paige with Paiges Yoga. It's August 2022, and I want to talk to you today about a text called the Yoga Sutras. Now, I'm not here to debate ancient texts and to talk about meanings and somebody else's interpretation, and everybody can have different meanings to it. And you can always study from people who are much more expert scholars on it, absolutely. But what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about it from a general standpoint and how it could be applicable to you today. And that's sort of my favorite thing to do, is to make it approachable, not to bring it down and make it where I'm dismissing something that could be much deeper in its context, but to make it more approachable. And what I want to talk to you today is about the various volumes and where it existed from, and then talk to you about how I use it as something that you may consider. How do I use it in my daily life? So the Yoga Sutras, let's talk about it. You're going to find, if you were to look it up, there's so many different copies. I have them. Look at the size difference, and you'll already just be like, well, how could it be different in size? Because it can. People have decided to take the sutras and expand upon it with their meanings, their explanations in it, so that can add to the volume. The word sutra means string, and interesting enough, even in this one, this is actually where it starts. So the whole first half of the book is about where it came from, what it's about. And you can always study that more. I'm not here to talk about really where it came from, except to say that it's an older version, the first one that somebody actually decided to write it down. That means these were actually taught verbally before they were written. So they're actually not sure exactly how long they've existed. Interestingly enough, they were taught verbally from father to son. That's the way they were taught. And then allowing ourselves to realize, well, what's wrong with learning it verbally? That's actually how I use it. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. I found myself working with adolescents, and instead of asking them to read it or tell me back and tell me what that means and read it back to me, I wanted them to have more of a felt expression of what the meaning of yoga is about. So I actually teach them the sutras. We start off just by learning the first few. And the very first one, don't take my word for it, I tell people, now the teachings of yoga begins. Okay. Now, it being such an important word in this string. Now. Instead of waiting for the right moment. Instead of hoping that it would be a different way. Or finding a reason that we're worried about or defensive about. No, we simply begin now. Now, that can be for people different ages, different experiences. Sometimes it's coming back to. Right? We've lost our way. We're unbalanced. Now the teachings of yoga begin. Yoga is the settling of the mind. And this text says into silence. Okay. Others will use different words, like it's just the settling of the mind. Okay. Let's remember that verse, though, because that string is the one I come back to often when I'm working with people in general, with yoga. And I'll stop and say, so what makes what we're doing yoga? There's where confusion can lie, because we as human beings can be led astray. And we need to be anchored back, stop and begin again. Now we do our yoga. It's always a cycling process coming back to. Yoga is to settle the mind. And that is something I'm teaching them verbally. So that eventually when I ask them that question, it's not about the things they may have thought, but it's to question, is it settling the mind? Or was it doing more than that? Okay. When the mind is settled, we are established in our essential nature. This explains why we're doing this. Why do we care about settling the mind? Because when the mind is settled, we're established in our essential nature. We're our truest form of ourselves. Maybe if that doesn't interest you, maybe it's just a different word. that's okay, because this was interpreted, meaning there could be words that weren't the ones that were used in Sanskrit that interpreted into English words. So maybe it's more personal than just your nature, your internal nature. It could just be a place of feeling balanced, peaceful, whatever that word is for you. That's why we're worried about doing it. That's why we decided to start our yoga. The essential nature is usually overshadowed by the activity of the mind. So now it starts to explain, though, hold on a second. Although we know we want these things and we want to have settling of the mind and why we're doing it, there are going to be a few obstacles in your way. This part always interests me to talk about because these same obstacles are listed in other texts as well. Okay, and you can look into those and even see how they cross-compare totally different texts at different time, even a different part of our planet, and they still talked about some of the same ones. These will be misunderstandings that cause suffering, meaning they're going to get in the way. They're going to keep you from finding that place that is settled. What are they? Understanding, misunderstanding, imagination, sleep, memory. Let's go into that more. Understanding and misunderstanding. I'm going to bring these two together because here's what's the definition of delusion. Thinking something is when it isn't, and when something isn't when it is. We have an understanding or misunderstanding. We may think we understand something so much that we can't allow the idea that maybe it's not correct or true. We may believe something so much that we misunderstand it, but we don't know we're misunderstanding. Delusion's a tough one. We would have to actually admit and be open to the idea that it's maybe. Maybe we know it. Maybe we don't. And by creating capacity in our mind to think maybe is possible to shift into settling. Now, it's possible, but it also suggests we're going to have a problem because of that. Okay. Misunderstanding. The delusion stems from a false impression, and understanding is the correct knowledge based on perception. But the reliability and testimony of others is what we believe is our understanding of it. So we lack this idea of using our own discretion, our own ability to think for ourselves. Imagination. Also, I've used the word fantasy. Now look, imagination, fantasy, it's needed. It's needed as part of the brain. It creates and it develops. But the problem is that when we live in fantasy so much that we don't live in reality and in the truth of now, well, that can hold us back because we only want the fantasy. We want to live in the fantasy so much that we hold on to it because reality is just too much for us to deal with. I'm not judging these characters. What I'm saying is they will hold us back and add suffering. Sleep. Oh yeah. Not having the right amount of sleep, not sleeping well, will leave us in a place where we're foggy and can't think clearly. That's why it's listed. Now, these things aren't there to say that they're bad and that we're going to fix them and never have them again. We just understand they'll be a part of human nature. That will be an obstacle in our way. Further along, and understanding, well, don't give up hope. It doesn't mean that we can't get there, is something called the 8 limbs. The 8 limbs of yoga in the Yoga Sutra, the place that's sort of the recipe, if you don't mind my use of that word, the recipe that just kind of allows us to say, so here you go, follow these particular limbs, these particular steps. The recipe, though, doesn't have to be followed in order. It's not like making a cake. Okay, you can go out of order. You can also remove some. The idea is to move some in different orders, not do some, and then also consider when you put it back in what the effect is. So if you understand the first 2 limbs as rules for living, rules for life. That's what I've been told. I don't really like that phrasing though. So even though it refers to that as that, yamas, niyamas, I really find the yamas and niyamas are less about rules. It's less about what not to do, but more about what to do. And that little change of thought that goes, well, why worry about it? Well, some of the items discussed is that you should live a life where you're truthful, non-harming, and able to move in a way in your life that is more peaceful. And it'd be hard to argue with that, to go, well, honestly, like how could I be more peaceful, loving, kind, or even just bliss? How could I reach that place where my mind is settled if I was doing those things? So while I'm not killing things or hurting others or lying or stealing or taking things. Yeah, that would be fair to say. So I think on a philosophical level, we can say, yes, that makes sense. I hope we can agree on that, but now living it's different. And that's where some people decide to focus their yoga on some of those things. You can go into much deeper philosophical texts that want to break down the yamas, niyamas. There are books on those. I'm sure there's tons of YouTubes just on those. That's for a different discussion. But just know that that's what that is. Other ways to purify. The steps are there to help us purify, come back to now, come back to the inner self that is peaceful. Remembering, what's the point of yoga? To settle the mind. So some people use their body to purify. So they use asana to purify. Sometimes they use pranayama to purify, breath work. Right? We withdraw then into the upper levels of the senses, concentrate, and then your body's ready for meditation. And then finally to the place where the settling of the mind begins. It's an interesting place, samadhi. I remember thinking of it and listening to it philosophically, but it always sounded like such a far off, distant land. Until I started really experiencing it, noticing this place that was much more settled, sure. It was calmer, absolutely. But it's never ending. So it's not as if we do reach a mountaintop. No, every single day you got to climb the mountain again. And many, many, many days you don't reach it. And many days you fall on your butt and you find yourself at base camp. Okay? And it takes a lot to just pick up, begin again. So for many, the practice of yoga doesn't stop. It's a continuation. We begin again. Now we start our yoga. What makes what we're doing yoga? There are plenty of people who practice this purification of yoga without using asana. And yet, I find in my culture, in my particular area, yoga is the asana. They take what they see with their eyes and say, there, it's yoga, it's a pose. No, it isn't. So I can't look at something and know if it's yoga. Okay, it could be something else. And this isn't to put it down, it's just what makes it yoga. I work with a number of people where they do the similar kinds of positions in gymnastics, ballet, Pilates. They can compare it instantly to something they have experienced and done. And that's where I have to start with them. What then makes this yoga? What differentiates the physical movement to yoga? And we start off with, it should be settling the mind. Learning to be aware without judgment. And what helps us to do that? Some of us withdraw into the senses. Notice the room and the space. Some of us use it through pranayama, breath work. And I'll say it again. There are yogic practices without asana. And yet sometimes we have to be with that long enough to realize what obstacle's in my way. Truth is that many of our obstacles are sometimes learned behavior. If I'm not doing something, if I'm looking at a pose and I've been told and taught that this pose had to be a certain way, and I'm living that over and over again, there may be a point in the practice under the right supervision where we suddenly observe that that isn't truth. The idea, again, against all of these steps, the recipes, was to use these things so that we could check on those obstacles I mentioned. That's a lot to take in already. And I'm not asking you to be a perfect person today, just asking for you to consider some of the things I said. You may even go back and listen to it again, what I said. Because as a human being, we may think we hurt, but there's a lot of obstacles in your day. You may be tired and fatigued or hungry, tired, angry, upset, worried. All kinds of obstacles that could keep us from actually hearing what someone was saying. And I love asana, so don't even think I'm saying it doesn't have anything to do with that. It's just that if we get back to the root of it, there's many kinds of yoga, meaning there's many ways that people choose to settle the mind. The Yoga Sutras is just what I define as the root. It's the base camp. Let's at least take ourselves to it every now and then. Stop. What makes it yoga? It's not something that can be seen. It's something way deeper. I encourage you to keep exploring that. Be curious. Don't be perfect. Make some mistakes. Probably learn from those more. My hope is that this discussion helped. It helped you in some capacity, maybe just to be more curious, learn more, get some books, go to workshops, listen to speakers talk about it more. Develop your own opinion of it. Have a good day for no reason.